On Being a Pagan. Alain de Benoist. Translated by John Graham, edited by Greg Johnson. 2004. Originally published in French under the title Comment peut-on, étre, paien? Under the pen name Albin Michel, 1981. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 25, Tolerance and Inner Freedom. One of the most scandalous charms of pagan Rome, Gabriel Matzneff notes ironically, is this tolerance, this respect for others. I have already mentioned this issue of pagan tolerance, by showing that it was born, as a principle, from both recognition of human diversity and a denial of dualism, which entails the acknowledgement of the variety of faces of God within one Unitarian affirmation of the divine. But tolerance, as we have clearly seen, is also born of the lucid awareness of the coincidence of opposites in God. If there is no irreducible alterity between concepts, no impossible reconciliation, then nothing and no one could embody absolute evil, which is why tolerance is called for. We know the words of Symmachus: what does it matter which ways each follows in pursuit of the truth? One does not always reach the solution to this great mystery by one path. This means that one summit can be attained by various ways, that the deity speaks to each people according to the tongue it understands, that the language of this being that is the world is spoken in a multitude of inner worlds, forever inspiring new forms of fulfillment and going beyond the self. It is not by chance the majority of representatives of Che religion of Europe also made themselves the defenders of freedom and a positive tolerance that is not to be confused with either liberalism or the absence of opinions, nor with indifference with respect to values. Nicholas of Cusa, although a cardinal, defended the merits of paganism. Erasmus protested forcefully against religious intolerance. Pico della Mirandola developed the idea of a pax philosophica. Marguerite de Navarre argued for the same thing, as did Sebastian Franck. Luther himself re-established the right of interpretation and free examination. Paganism can only react against the Christian theme of man's corruption by original sin, and against the idea of man's a priori guilt, that certain modern ideologues have not failed to borrow and exploit for their own needs in the sense of an intentional amnesia, self-negation, or auto-racism. We know how Christianity revealed itself to be more radical in this domain than Judaism, mainly under the influence of Pauline theology. Then Augustinian theology and Protestantism increased its radical nature. In Judaism, Adam's failing is not properly speaking a hereditary fault, but rather a blemish. It is a defect stuck in Ime and does not necessarily flow out onto all men, as the gift of the Ten Commandments through the revelation from Sinai has essentially eliminated it. Catholic theology is more willingly based on the commentary of St. Paul, Romans 5:12-21, than on the text of Genesis 3:1-24. By one man sin has entered the world, and death through sin. And so death has passed upon all men, because all have sinned. Original sin, however, did not ontologically alter human nature substantially, it merely polluted the relationship between man and God. Man retains the ability to do good and refrain from doing evil. Luther, to the contrary, adopted a theology which was not only inspired by St. Augustine but also betrays a certain Gnostic contamination. This led him to declare that, since the sin committed by Adam and Eve, man's nature and essence were entirely corrupted and disfigured. Human nature is subject to the prowess of the devil and delivered into his power. Man is intrinsically evil. The truth is that man, having become a bad tree, can only wish and do evil. In 1516, Luther made the negation of man's fundamental freedom the starting point of his doctrine of justification. In 1525, in his response to Erasmus, he again declared that fallen human nature was incapable of any good. In opposition to this theology of original sin, paganism asserted that man, by constructing himself and leading a life in conformity with the principles he gives it, can confer a meaning on life. Paganism declares that there is no need for man to be cleansed of a hereditary original sin by the intermediary of a Redeemer, nor any need for him to work toward the advent of messianic times. In short, he was in his thoughts and deeds, his choices and his works, sufficient unto himself. Augustine's great adversary, Pelagius, arguing in favor of the prerogatives of free will, declared that man could live without sin, and this was what God desired. To the Augustinian conception of grace, a grace due to biblical election through the intermediary of a Redeemer, he opposed a grace of creation, a grace of the perpetual immanence of divine nature and human nature, which allows man to act entirely according to his will. For Augustine there is a contradiction between grace and liberty. For Pelagius, it is a fusion of both qualities in the same reality. For Meister Eckhart as well, the union of human will and divine will can only be a completely consensual act. It is not original sin that separates man from God, but his self-indulgence, his inability to become sovereign over himself, to attain an active impersonality, an Olympian detachment, Gelassenheit be it, that would be the equivalent of full self-mastery. Through the voice of his Prometheus, Buddha exclaims, "You, my ardent and sacred heart, have you not completely fulfilled yourself? Whereas Dr. Faustus, after defying Mephistopheles, eventually triumphs, thus justifying all the confidence God has placed in him. For Kant, the foundation of morals does not reside in any law exterior to man, but clearly within man, in the depths of his heart, in the categorical imperative. This moral imperative in the form of morality which Spengler will describe in The Decline of the West is Faustian and uniquely Faustian, in the very roots of inner consciousness, and that it is the respect for this imperative that reveals to man the dignity of his own being and allows him to take part in the eternal order. Religion is therefore the recognition of all our duties as a divine command, which no longer amounts to deducing ethical regulations from the existence of God. Later, in the extreme case, it is the deduction of God's existence from the presence of a morality inherent to the human spirit. Nikolai Berdyaev, finally, also provided an apology for the human creative act, in which he saw the essential theme of life. Speaking only of Christ as a symbol of the encounter between man and the divine that takes place inside each of us, he wrote, God sets no limits on human freedom. God expects of man that he takes part in the work of creation, in the pursuit of the creation of this world. Man, according to pagan thought, must also recognize the possibility of a perfectly consubstantial relationship with the divine. This union with the divine signifies nothing other than man's appropriation of his own inner freedom. On final appeal, man is fundamentally free in his inner core, free to grow or to shrink, free to gain or lose self-esteem, and the self-esteem of those who share his values. Freedom in paganism is neither the destruction of all the disciplines, nor the free acceptance of submission to Yahweh's desires. It is reintegration of the inner man, a freely desired reintegration, for it alone is capable of getting us in the desired shape of our own specific nature, free of the constraint that Judeo-Christian monotheism places on a being who is radically distinguished from the world. Pico della Mirandola has God address man in these terms: you can lower yourselves to the level of the beast, but you can also be reborn as a divine creature by the free will of your spirit. Man can become what he likes, subhuman or superman, as he wishes.